Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Debbie Gatte. I'm Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at the Philanthropy Roundtable. And we have with us two special panelists today to cover the topic of the very latest on free speech, the newest numbers tell all. I will introduce them in a moment, but just to help set this up, I mean, for years, groups such as the Knight Foundation and the Foundation of Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, much shorter, have been discussing the First Amendment. Agreement with the First Amendment, a unique American principle, has been wavering among younger people. And in response, organizations such as these have been focused on education around free speech and have been working in many different ways to create room for debate and discussion. So the Philanthropy Roundtable hosting today represents the largest network committed to advancing liberty, opportunity, and personal responsibility. We know many of you are concerned about the state of our college campuses and whether the intellectual climates that exist there allow for a diversity of ideas to be explored by young people and the faculty who help shape our cultural conversations. So here today with us are Sam Gill and Greg Lukianoff. Sam is Senior Vice President and Chief Program Officer at the Knight Foundation. In this role, he oversees all of Knight's grant-making programs, the community and national initiatives, journalism and arts, and he also oversees learning and impact, Knight's research and assessment program. He joined the foundation in 2015. Welcome and good morning, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
And Greg Lukianoff is an attorney, a New York Times bestselling author, and the president and CEO of FIRE. He's the author of Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of the American Debate, Freedom from Speech, and FIRE's Guide to Free Speech on Campus, as well as co-author of Coddling of the American Mind, written with Jonathan Haidt, a professor at NYU. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So let's start with what we promised in the title. Let's talk about the recent survey work that your organization, each of your organizations has done, and what findings stood out to you. I'm interested in hearing whether there were any surprises. What were you happy to learn about? What challenges do you see? And what challenges are there with doing this survey work? So let's maybe start with the surveys and what you learned. Sam, why don't we start with you?
Sure. And again, thanks for pulling this conversation together. Thanks so many of you for joining. The importance of the First Amendment is a bedrock value of the Knight Foundation. It was a bedrock value of our founders, the Knight brothers, in their newspaper company and the way that they operated it. And since 2016, when there was particularly a lot of controversy starting to percolate on college campuses, remember in the fall of 2015, there was sort of an infamous incident at the University of Missouri on which a stringer photographer was barred from taking a picture of a public protest event. We've been asking the views of college students about free speech and free expression, and since 2004, we've actually been asking the views of high school students about press freedom and free expression. And earlier this year, we released our latest survey of college students, and this was in the field kind of at the end of 2019. So this has been a turbulent year, by any measure. And so I think the part of the discussion today can be, what's changed. But a few of the things that stood out to us are, first, college students continue to evince a kind of paradoxical ambivalence about free expression and exactly what it means. So, for example, 81% of students widely support a campus environment where students are exposed to all types of speech, including speech they may find offensive. And this has been pretty consistent across the years we've surveyed this. But 78% also favor colleges providing safe spaces defined as areas of campus that are designed to be free from threatening actions, ideas, or conversations. These are sort of equal proportions hold these views. I think one of the other interesting things that we've been finding as we dig into this is that speech related to concerns about identity and inclusion and diversity are becoming more salient. So, for example, we asked students this year, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statement? The First Amendment protects people like me. And, strong majorities of all students of all identities and creeds tend to agree with this. But when you look at strongly agree, you start to see some intensity differences. So for example, 44% of all college students strongly agree with this statement. That's 55% of men versus 39% of women. And it's 53% of white students versus 25% of Black students and 39% of students who are Hispanic. So you see these intensity drop-offs of whether people really think this value is for them and protects them based on their identity, their expressed identity. We also asked people, students, about whether they've ever felt unsafe because of something someone said. And again, you see big differences here between men and women, and between white students and students of other races. And then a place that you start to see more unanimity, but that I think is related to these sorts of concerns, is around the kinds of speech restrictions that students are willing to endorse. So for example, across all the years that we've done this polling, about fewer than a third of students tend to support restrictions around political views. They tend to sort of get that political views are really the thing that the First Amendment and the ethos of the First Amendment protects. But they feel very differently about speech that might be offensive to someone based on or even threatening based on their identity. So for example, over all 3 years of polling, majorities of students have been in favor of restrictions around slurs, racial and ethnic slurs, and around stereotypical costumes. This was a big issue 4 or 5 years ago in a number of campuses, and those rates have actually increased. So students are even more in favor of those sorts of restrictions right now. So I think those are some of the tensions that I wanted to make sure to highlight from some of our recent polling.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting. You ask the top level question, and as you start to drill down and segment, you start to see different trends emerge. So that's extremely helpful. Thank you, Sam. And if there is more that you want to share later, I'm sure we'll have a chance to bring some of that in. Greg, what about the survey work that FIRE did? And I think yours was a little bit later in the year compared to the end of 2019 that Sam described. What did you find?
Yeah, we just started launching our big survey project right as COVID started hitting, but we were able to get it in more or less under the wire. So preliminary thing to say, this has been the busiest summer in FIRE's existence. We have received more requests for help than ever before in our history by a lot. We had many times as many case submissions in June than we would normally have in a regular June. Also, I want to note that we've been asked to do rankings of schools for years, depending on how good they are for free speech. And hopefully, if some of you have read my work in Coddling the American Mind, I take research very seriously. So I want something very rigorous rather than just we can evaluate the constitutionality of codes, but actually drilling down on what attitudes are like on campus was something that was kind of beyond our reach for a long time. But thanks to a specialized organization called College Pulse, we were able to do what is now the largest survey of student attitudes about free speech. We did it at 55 schools and involved about 20,000 students, and we could really drill down into what attitudes were. And we ranked the schools. So I'm always it's kind of funny because you asked what surprises us. I am generally, I've trained myself enough that when something actually confirms my biases, I'm skeptical. But University of Chicago did place number 1 out of the 55 schools that we ranked. That points out that, saying things that actually talking a good game on free speech matters. Definitely we've seen differences, just like Sam said, among political affiliation, gender, race, religion, and more. Black students were actually had reported the highest rates of being uncomfortable about talking about issues on campus, which was interesting. The acceptance of violence was something that we didn't actually factor into schools' ranking, and I'm trying to figure out if there's a way we can, because some of that stuff was really concerning. More than 60% of people who self-defined as extreme liberals said it is always or sometimes acceptable to shout down a speaker, compared to 15% of extreme conservatives. And the problems we saw in the Ivy League in particular, that was something that also, kind of confirmed something that Haidt and I had noticed, is that a lot of the more hot ideological issues are more intense in Ivy League schools and more elite schools. When I go to working class schools, they have, state schools, they oftentimes have similar issues. They just don't seem to have the same kind of heat, for lack of a better word. But so, for example, 37% of Ivy League students say that shouting down a speaker is always or sometimes acceptable, compared to 26 who aren't at Ivy Leagues. Also not a great number. So my goal here, and the thing is that this study is deep, and I'm very thankful to College Pulse, but also Sean Stevens, someone who joined us from Heterodox Academy, who's the real expert on all this stuff. It's extremely interesting for us, and in addition to surprises, Brown placing surprisingly in the top 10 of schools that are good on free speech was a surprise. We definitely wanted to make sure a school was both getting good rankings from liberals and conservatives, because you could get a fantastic rating on how free you speak if you have a completely homogenous sample who's saying, I can say whatever I want, everyone here agrees with me. So we did that comparison, and definitely the number of conservative students who feel like it's a great environment was decidedly lower, but still enough to get them in the top 10. Harvard placing in the bottom 10 was a shock. DePaul University, a school I don't really think that much, being dead last was a shock. UT Austin being next to dead last, basically almost being tied for last, was a shock. I was very disappointed that my alma mater, Stanford, was kind of right in the middle. UNC Chapel Hill, which has always actually been in our experience quite good, placed towards the middle, unfortunately. So my big hope is to expand this to more schools, but also start to factor in fire cases. And I want to do that in a rigorous way, so we don't end up in a situation where it's like, we think this school is number 3 according to students, but it's also a school that fired a tenured professor or kicked a student out, or a school ranks really at the bottom, but every time a case has come to them, they've actually been really good. So we're trying to figure out a way to do that, and I wasn't really sure we'd ever have the capacity to do that in a really rigorous way, but right now I actually think we're almost there.
Wow, that is going to be tremendously useful, I think, for everyone to have those kinds of rankings. Just a quick follow-up question for you, Greg. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that Chicago being number 1 was not a surprise, given the way they have led in terms of the principles that they have on campus, that they apply very seriously. When you looked at the bottom end of it, was the same correlation there, that they don't have, they're missing those kinds of Chicago principles type approaches? There's a correlation between.
Well, definitely the thing that has been really clear, and it definitely pans out in the research, is that leadership matters a lot. And I've seen, it's interesting because I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, and I'd say in the from 2000 to 2012. My job was overwhelmingly dealing with administrators, and students were actually quite good on free speech. And, Coddling the American Mind is really the book is trying to get to the bottom of what happened. Like, it's something really, really dramatically shifted. But during my first 10 years of doing this, there were lots of free speech controversies that would come up that were just as hot and heavy as they are now. But a president would very quickly say, nope, publicly, and the case would just fizzle. There seems to be fewer presidents willing to do that, but we still see if presidents are willing to do that, a lot of cases fizzle. But if a president says, we're investigating it, we'll consider. I mean, Sarah Lawrence's handling of the case when they were trying to get rid of Sam Abrams at Sarah Lawrence was not exactly a picture of how you handle this. Apparently, and I know Sam well, so I trust him very much. And he said initially, when students were demanding that he get kicked out, by the way, he get kicked out for writing an article in the New York Times citing pretty much uncontroversial data that says administrators probably lean even more to the left than faculty. And there was a big movement to get him fired. And he was told by the university president, maybe you should consider finding another job. Mm-hmm. That's not the way you handle these situations. If you're clear from the beginning, often they end up becoming, at least the demand that someone get fired tends to fizzle.
So I'd recommend to both of you and to the people listening in today to take a look at the recording that we'll make available pretty soon from our annual meeting last week, where President Zimmer from the University of Chicago had a chance to talk about the role of university leadership on these issues and what it takes to actually create that climate. So I think, yes, he would concur based on what he said at that session. And I'd encourage people to listen to that for more. I'm going to jump to, since we're on this topic of leadership, I'm going to jump to a question that I think is related. So what is the role of speech on a campus? And you just spoke about leadership. What is the purpose that speech serves on a campus in a university setting? And leadership is there to create the right, the right environment, but what role does speech serve at a university? That seems to be a very basic question that underlies the reason that we care about these survey results. So Sam, why don't we start with you on that question?
Yeah, well, I think it's important I think one of the really important things to do in this discussion, particularly about campuses, is to separate out the different kinds of discourse and speech that are happening at campuses. Maybe the same principle should apply, but they're not all the same and they're not experienced the same by students. So I think one mistake we sometimes make is saying campuses are places of inquiry and ideas. Therefore, every speech act must be viewed through that lens. Well, there are also places where students live. If they're residential campuses, they're places where students work. They're obviously places where administrators and staffers at the university and faculty members work sometimes and sometimes live as well. And one of the things we've asked in our last two surveys of students is, where is most of the political discussion happening? And they don't say the classroom, a majority say online. They're having discussions online. Those discussions aren't really happening on campus in a sense. They've become globalized because of the internet. I think one of the big challenges schools often have when they sometimes make the wrong call on these things is that they're dealing with speech that's happening from outside of the campus community, even sometimes from outside the country that's participating in a debate or an idea that's sparked by a faculty member or a student through social media or through some other forum that even the university is holding under official auspices. And so the reason I say that distinction is really important is, one rule of speech, and especially in the classroom, which is an environment that has rules and conventions and expectations associated with it, is absolutely inquiry. It's particularly in an institution of higher ed, about the advancement of knowledge, about the advancement of ideas, about the advancement of the capabilities and skills of working with ideas and working with knowledge. In many cases, pedagogically is about a feeling of discomfort. And that's one context in which speech is happening. But sometimes that speech is about the normal social and political intercourse of living in an environment. And that speech is different. And I think that one of the things we have to figure out is how is that speech experienced differently by students? Another thing that we've asked of students is sort of what their experience of online speech is. And even though this is the digitally native generation, they're very ambivalent about, they think it's easy to shut people down that you don't agree with. They think it's easy to shame people. They have serious concerns about the anonymity of online speech. And one thing that I've often said too, and you'll hear this from accounts of people who have been the victims of mass trolling and things like that online on sort of both sides of the aisle, is the experience of someone in person saying, I think you're wrong, is very different than the experience of 10,000 people popping up in your feed saying, not only do I think you're wrong, but I think these other 5 things about you, as an inference of the fact that you're wrong. And again, that's not to say that we ought to restrict speech, but it's to say that as we think about the role of speech on campus, to your question, we have to really be thinking differently about these sites of speech. And I think that will inform to some extent our approaches. Some of those approaches will be more juridical in the form of rules, and some of those approaches will be about behavior and training and expectation and convention on a college campus as well.
So Sam, if I take your point, it's that a campus is made up of several different complex subsystems, and that these different subsystems have different purposes and therefore possibly different rules or a different role for speech, right? So in the classroom, it's one thing. Outside the classroom, when kids are in a dorm, is a different thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Greg,
possibly rules, but yeah, possibly just expectations. I'm less worried about, I'll just sort of put a fine point on it. Yeah. Students who say, I find that someone would possibly teach John Stuart Mill in this class offensive because although he was a feminist, he wasn't enough of a feminist, I think is an argument that has to be scrutinized with a different lens than I'm really worried about the way that I'm getting bullied online because of something that I said in class, outside of class. We have to look at those two things very differently. One may raise real concerns about the fortitude of our students. The latter one, I'm not sure raises quite the same. It raises different concerns, frankly, about the way that people are treating each other and engaging in discourse, I would argue.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And Greg, how do you view the role of speech on a campus? And,
well,
what purpose does it serve? Yeah.
I think that Sam and I, of course, have a little bit of difference of emphasis on this. We don't really disagree. Just more like what's more on what on the overall what's important, but the emphasis is a little bit different. And as far as I'm concerned, I think campuses have largely lost the thread and forgot to remind students that this is supposed to be a special place for a particular purpose, and not for a particular purpose it theoretically serves, for a purpose it actually serves, which is the production of human knowledge. And I think it's of profound importance because it's not just US that relies on these engines of knowledge. It's the entire globe now that actually looks to American higher education. And I think that it's on at administrations and administrators to do a better job of inspiring students to that end. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we, FIRE created an orientation for students, because we think they have to start explaining this on day one. Because I've been saying this, from the very beginning. It's like set expectations early, because what I think orientations do at the moment is they set expectations to talk to someone, talk to the bias-related incident program if someone's being offensive, without being as much, without emphasizing as much as, guys, this is a really big important thing you're now a part of. And that's why I think they need to say it early and often. And that's one of the reasons why I think some of these schools, with good leadership have ranked higher, but I think we could do even better than that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that actually I published in I don't know if it's out yet, but in the Philanthropy Roundtable magazine. Coming soon. I recommend 6 things alumni and donors can do to help benefit their schools. And that, of course, are very simple things, including like get rid of your speech code, stand by your professors and students when they get in trouble, have an orientation that inspires, have that orientation done by faculty. I feel pretty strongly about that one. Find out your climate, actually poll your own students, do some of that work for us, and do things like pass the Chicago Statement. It is symbolic, but it tells you a lot about a campus if they can't pass it. And it also tells people who their friends are when it comes to this stuff. But I am concerned that the sort of like residential aspect, the this is my home aspect of higher education, which I'm sympathetic to a degree, is overwhelming the larger, more important, and I'm perfectly happy to say more important function of higher education. It's one of the reasons why Haidt and I were kind of surprised at the end of Coddling the American Mind to find ourselves advocating for a gap year. Because, it was Eric Posner who wrote back in 2012 saying, listen, students aren't as mature as they used to be, so we have to actually start bringing down we have to start clamping down on offensive speech because the younger kids can't handle it. And of course, that drags down this entire essential institution. And when I would talk to students, I'm like, please prove Eric Posner wrong on this, But I am concerned that but first we have to actually start by telling them. We can't throw up our hands until someone's actually explained to them that they're part of a very special institution that is going to be difficult if done correctly.
So has that orientation program launched, Greg?
Yeah, we launched it actually right before or right at the beginning of the lockdown. We had a lot of web materials almost ready to go right when the lockdown started. So we really sped those up to make sure, and a lot of our high school modules, for example, started getting picked up all over the country, which was pretty cool.
Okay. Well,
can I respond to that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Just to pull the thread out. So I think it's a really interesting conversation, because I think I definitely agree with some of the conclusions and concerns. I would add some elements to some of the causes. I think some universities have lost the thread of what the higher purposes of education are. I think some of them are struggling to add a new thread, which is that they should be ahead of the country in democratizing access to knowledge. They should be ahead of the country in some of the social debates we're having about what an inclusive country looks like. And those are easier values they're hard enough to articulate in the abstract, but much easier to articulate in the abstract than to actually create a community that can do, especially a community. By the way, universities are unique in how much inertia they have. And so unlike a lot of other bureaucracies, because of tenure, because of other things like that, for example, universities couldn't say, we're going to change our faculty composition over the next 2 years and get that done. It wouldn't be possible to do. They've got these legacy structures that take more time. And I think that one of the unfortunate side effects of that is that really well-intentioned efforts and offices that have been created have effectively become the places that we've delegated the work of enabling students to actually have access to using argument in order to challenge legacy views. So, just an example that I would give of this that was in the news that may sort of spark a lot of comment is, so my alma mater is the University of Chicago, and an editor of a really important journal in economics was placed on leave and investigated for allegedly mocking Martin Luther King Day in a class. And what was really interesting was the debate became about whether he should have been placed under investigation on the basis of an allegation. All of the inertial energy in the university went into substantiating the allegation, as opposed to actually asking some really important questions, like why do 3 journals matter in economics? And are those journals actually creating mobility for different scholars and ideas in the field, or are they entrenching the same ideas over and over? Another really good question that should be asked is, does it actually have a negative effect on young scholars of color if that comment is made? And what do we need to do to actually empower and enable those scholars of color? If those scholars of color actually see in that comment and other work evidence of frameworks that they say contain things like implicit bias around economics, how do we enable their scholarship to be able to problematize those ideas? One of the most interesting things that happened in economics over the past couple of years is lots and lots of women economists are now delivering papers at APA that use econometrics to show systematic bias against women economists in the field of economics. And I think that's a great example of using knowledge and the methods of economics and the aims of education to be able to actually dismantle some of these structures of discrimination. But we should ask ourselves, why did it take so long, and invest our bureaucratic energy in that, as opposed to potentially in some of these investigatory processes that I think sometimes just have the effect of confirming for people that their side is right in some of these debates. So that might be us. Again, I think Greg is right. Like, we have different emphases, and that might be the place where my emphasis takes me. But I wouldn't disagree. Like, so much of this bureaucracy is being instrumentalized to take us away from the point of education, as opposed to using the thing the university does well to move society forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Greg, do you have a response?
Well, actually, I wanted to, is it okay if I jump to a different point that I really would love to make to this audience?
Sure. Let me just ask Sam one thing then before we move away from this. So,
yep.
Sam, is that a new thread, or is that the purpose of a university applied to a different problem? And the reason I'm putting it that way is it sounds like what you're describing is the advancement of knowledge, but on a problem that maybe has more attention right now. So, is it a new thread of what is happening at universities, or the role of the university, but just applied to a different problem?
Well, I mean, I do think part of the role of a university is to democratize access to knowledge, and I also think knowledge is not value neutral. I mean, you go back to Weber and science as a vocation, and at some point you have to ask some pretty basic questions about your core values that animate the structure of knowledge and the nature of questions you ask. So if you assume that, at least in the moment we live in, social identity is relevant to which questions get asked, then you have to assume that if there are things like discrimination or lack of diversity or lack of inclusion, then you're not asking all the questions that you can and should be asking to advance knowledge. And I think, by the way, universities have never seen the drive toward knowledge as a value neutral endeavor. They've seen it as an essential endeavor to building a society that lives up to sort of our highest personal virtues, public virtues, and material objectives. So I don't see it as wholly new. What I do think, though, is that when this is a debate not about the university, but a social debate about identitarian politics, and the university just becomes the object location for that debate, then I think the question gets a lot trickier to deal with. Anyway, but
that makes sense. And then so one more question for you, Sam, before we move to Greg's other point. So we do talk a lot also about when we're talking about democratizing knowledge. There is a long-standing discussion about conservatives and libertarians in the academy having a harder time being integrated and having their work accepted and raised. Do you think the same arguments apply in the case of faculty who hold, views that are more conservative and libertarian as part of this process, or how do you view that?
I think there's no
it.
question. And by the way, one thing that people of all parties agree on in our college student surveys is that conservatives have a harder time being heard on campus. Like even liberals agree. Like we're sort of in charge. I think very unfortunately, I think actually universities are paradoxically the most impoverished environments, particularly elite universities, in two dimensions of diversity, at least, or actually three. I mean, I would say diversity of race in faculty and student ranks has a huge distance to go, as does diversity in ideology. And I would say that that's true in gender as well. And so I think it is really unfortunate that the places that we hold up as the icons of knowledge, particularly elite universities, tend to be universities that have very narrow ideological views, far less diversity of race than I think we would expect, and far less diversity of gender than I think that we would expect. And I say that not just in terms of representation, but in terms of the way the incentives are rewarding the progress of those individuals. And I'm thinking principally about faculty ranks. I have less, frankly, astute knowledge about what the administrative faculty and student ranks. I have less astute knowledge about the administrative ranks.
Yeah, there are definitely been some interesting studies in economics around gender. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So I'm going to move back to Greg, what you wanted to raise. What was that? What did you want
well,
to
basically,
bring in?
It's conservative cynicism about higher education. I've been getting a lot of people that I've known for a long time just kind of giving up on higher education, saying that it's gotten too ideological, it's gotten too homogeneous, there's too much certainty and agreement, particularly among administrators, at different campuses. And there's no point. And I just have to remind them, listen, Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, they're still going to be super important in 50 years. They'll probably still be super important in 100 years. Do I think we give way too much credit to kids who go to the fancy schools in jobs? Absolutely. It was kind of funny to have me, John Haidt, and Malcolm Gladwell on stage at the YMCA in New York, all agreeing that we give too much credit to this, even though we've benefited from fancy schools. So there's no giving up on at least elite higher education. What happens to the middle tier schools in the meantime? That's a big question, and I think that there's actually some potential there to do some experimentation. And that's the sixth thing I added to my list of things to do, is that I think that if we could do something to at least break even or just crack the kind of unearned monopoly that currently our society seems to give to elite higher education for who you hire and that kind of stuff, then you could see some real possibility for reform that I think could be positive in all sorts of ways. Also, I just think there's a value in experimentation. So while at the same time, we're doing our best to, save higher education and save students so they make sure they can get through, and professors so they don't get fired when some of these really hot, particularly, and so everything, by the way, made more intense by social media, as Sam pointed out. I also think we need to get more experimental. We need cheaper, less bureaucratic, more rigorous models to compete with the sort of luxury brand. Once again, to pick on Sarah Lawrence, that you might have at like Sarah Lawrence. But I do think that experimentation would be really helpful here, and anything that could kind of because if an institution is essentially saying, in a more stratified society, I can guarantee that your children who you love will stay in the upper class if they get into the school, that's giving them a little bit too much power, and it allows them to, have ever-growing ratios of administrators to students to ever higher. Actually, I mean, honestly, in my opinion, the truly ludicrous argument that the $70,000 a year you have to pay at some of these schools covers only half. This is the argument they make to me all the time. Covers only half of the education of a student, and I'm just like, you can't figure out a way to educate a student for less than $140,000 a year. It strains credulity. So I definitely, at the same time, want to make sure that dissenters are able to get through higher education. I want to make sure that free speech is explained at a philosophical level, which is a big part of my life's mission, frankly. But at the same time, I think that there's going to have to be some experimentation that actually could make a much bigger difference. If basically people start drawing from some national competition more than they draw from Harvard, I think some of the things that I would like to see change would change relatively fast.
So maybe some of the cynicism that you mentioned at the beginning of that comment will lead to disruption, which, right, and innovation.
That's the hope.
Yeah, that's the hope. And a second observation from what you both said about the homogeneity. This is what Jonathan Haidt and some of the other social psychologists have been arguing, that actually is a negative for their field and their discipline, because it means they are missing, their scholarship is becoming narrow and focused, and they are not getting the challenge that they need from other perspectives. So that there's like more than just the fact that there's an actual danger that scholarship is going to deteriorate.
Well,
right?
that's one of the reasons why I was so concerned about the recent case we saw at St. John's. This was a case that was presented as if, initially, as if someone had said slavery was good in class, and it was actually a class on where a history teacher was talking about the Columbian Exchange, like what happened, how the world benefited and was harmed by Europeans discovering North and South America. Very serious historical question, but because it led to, and basically the question was it worth it on balance? And that's the kind of question historians ask. And, he was suspended because this discussion was really uncomfortable. And that's the thing that I think that we can't say enough. Thought experimentation, devil's advocacy, finding smart people with whom you actually disagree. These are all essential things. And I get worried that the idea of devil's advocacy and thought experimentation, every time I see that treated as a harm in and of itself, I'm like, wow, okay, this needs to be explained early and often.
Yeah.
I think there's because I do think this point of like universities are great places to market the values of free speech and the ethos of free speech, because you can put them to work right away. It's not like, if your employer extolling the values of free speech is not a great way to introduce you to the manual, the employment manual they can enforce. And so I do think, just again, and I end up being kind of the avatar of the progressive movement in these conversations, but I think there are some marketing opportunities like we really miss. So I think we do seize on these ones, which I think are really good examples of really important arguments that we actually have to engage in, and the way in which the administrative processes we use to drive values we otherwise think are also important, like diversity, end up being incredibly counterproductive. But I also think we miss some other really good moments. So for example, one of the things that young activists of color, for example, will say sometimes is they don't think the First Amendment protects them. And I think actually saying something like, yes, it actually is true. When the First Amendment in the past was instrumentalized to protect white heretics, it ended up getting to the Supreme Court. And when it was used to protect Black activists in certain communities, violence was then turned. The violence of the state was turned against them until other authorities stepped in. But in the end, because we had those constitutional structures to rely on, we were ultimately you had an argument of appeal. I think acknowledging, for example, that sometimes those rights aren't respected when they're trying to be utilized by a minority that is oppressed or perceives itself to be oppressed. I think I would say a similar example this summer was, and I know it won't feel fair to some people, but this is the example of if your manager gives you 4 pieces of positive feedback and 1 piece of negative feedback, you hear it as equal or whatever. So when the Harper's letter came out, I actually thought it was unfortunate, because many of the voices that were also saying it is good that people are taking to the streets and protesting and exercising their First Amendment rights on behalf of racial justice, were also some of the same voices in defense of the Harper's letter. And it felt, and because it might have been equivalent, it felt to so many young activists like they weren't hearing from that community in favor of their free speech rights in the one instance, at the same time that those people wanted to say disqualification of a professor is not the way that we're going to move society forward. And so I just think, like, don't miss those opportunities. Like, if you believe in the right, stand in those moments and be incredibly vocal and say, this is an example of us using this right to actually move our society forward. Whether I agree with what these people are protesting for, journalists, for example, who are getting arrested during those protests, we've got to stand up in those moments and point out the basic rights that are at stake. And I sometimes I think we miss those marketing opportunities.
Yeah, and I guess more than marketing, these are actually opportunities for us to be principled in the moment, right? So Sam,
Well,
very good point.
Debbie, I
Yeah,
need to vent some frustration on that point, though.
please.
Fire defends every meritorious case that comes to us as long as we have capacity. Sometimes we're just overwhelmed and can't keep up. And we defend, we're well known for defending students on the left. Our organization itself is probably more, our staff probably leans more to the left than the right. And it's interesting because like the cases where and this is something I've noticed in the media when it comes to marketing that frustrates me to death. If it's a case that looks like political correctness run amok, it obviously gets a lot of attention on Fox News, but it also weirdly gets a lot of attention sometimes in the New York Times. Like I don't know why, but the ones that look like that stereotype tend to pop up there. And then when we have cases involving people leaning to the left, they barely get attention. And we have these cases, again, all the time. Most professors are liberal. So, of course, when professors get in trouble, there's disproportionately a chance that it's a liberal professor. And those get okay coverage, but usually with this kind of snotty sort of internet thing of kind of like, see, you don't care about this case. And of course, sometimes people even say this to fire. I'm like, they don't even read the article to realize actually we're the ones who brought this to this newspaper. like we're quoted in the article you just sent me that you didn't bother to read. But there's also this big middle of cases where they're not particularly particular, are not particularly political. Universities are throwing their weight around. They're unfairly kicking out a student for sometimes speech-related stuff, sometimes just being bad for public relations. And these get virtually no coverage, no matter how hard we try. And so, like, I definitely hear what Sam is saying, but I just wish sometimes the media would play along a little better because I go on these shows sometimes and I'm like, guys, there's a big middle of cases that we should all be able to agree on it. Nobody should think that Texas Tech University having a 20-foot wide, free speech gazebo was ever good, and we've seen free speech zones all over the country. So yeah, and it's so basically what I'm saying is, at least for our organization, it's not for lack of trying, to get these things to grab the public attention.
I totally agree with you, Greg. And I think a lot of the nationalized media is really complicit. And I mentioned this earlier, when this isn't a debate about free speech, but is actually a debate about identity politics, where free speech is the sort of object site or universities are the object site, it serves no one. Like the thing that makes democracy work is you celebrating the second order interest in the democracy in its procedures. And I couldn't agree with you more, Greg. And I think the same thing happened on the left and the right around journalists during the George Floyd protests. It should have been a great moment for all media to say, here's one thing that shouldn't be happening. You shouldn't be arresting a CNN journalist. And instead it became a debate about what the inferred beliefs of that CNN journalist were, which was just totally beside the point. Greg is just pointing to such an important thing here.
So this is, I think, really important. So if bringing it to the attention of, and marketing isn't the answer necessarily, or what is how are we going to focus the attention on the right questions during these situations? And how can we, if traditional marketing isn't working, what do we do, Greg?
Oh yeah, and that's something that I'm really proud of Fire for, is that we may be constitutional lawyers largely, but we try to be really creative in how we reach audiences. Mm-hmm. So for example, we know we have to get to there's the emergency room function of Fire, which is essential. Like these individual students and professors need help. And the amazing thing is, like, I'm an old school ACLU guy. I'm willing to defend even highly offensive people, but I'm often defending pretty nice folks, which was kind of a pleasant surprise to a degree. But we also want to educate and inspire, because narratives matter. So for example, one project that we went with was doing a documentary about the life and times of Ira Glasser, the former head of the ACLU, who was just fantastic. Like, he's a phenom on free speech. And that's really a way to sort of tell a narrative, tell a life story. And that just came out, and we're extremely proud of it. It also deals with him being willing to defend the Nazis at Skokie, but then also reconciling with the person with this lovely old man who is on the other side of that. It's an amazing story, and it shows how it's consistent with racial justice. There's this wonderful story about once Jackie Robinson joined the Dodgers, he realized that they were quite literally on the same team, and how that inspired the rest of his work. Coddling the American mind, taking this from an interdisciplinary point of view really helps. I'm working on a comic book. We've already written one, basically the solution to getting the message out more is try everything, but also be creative. Don't expect that your press release is always going to get attention. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't, and don't just give up.
Mm.
Sometimes cracking a joke on Twitter can get you in front of a lot more people than unfortunately,
Yes.
than a well-structured press
Right,
release.
right, right. Well, can you believe it's already been 45 minutes since we started talking? I want to get to some of these other questions because
Yes, absolutely.
I think we do need to talk a little bit about 2020 because it has been, I'm just going to repeat what everyone says every day. 2020 is crazy. So we've already
Really?
mentioned, it's been
Did something happen?
it's a little different. So we've already mentioned COVID. We've already mentioned everything that happened after George Floyd, and it was a great reminder talking to you that was in May, and we are, there was quite a period after that of unrest. And now we've got an election coming up, and it's let's say a little heated. So what has changed on campus? So we've been talking about speech, but what has changed in terms of the intellectual climate on campus? Have we covered everything? Are there other things you want to highlight? These are students aren't on campus the way they've traditionally been on campus. Things are a little disrupted. Is there anything else that we need to highlight around 2020?
Just real quick, we have an entire category of cases now which are ridiculous COVID restrictions, and we try to be very deferential, and if something makes a lick of sense, in terms of a policy, then we're deferential to them. But like when students who are actually strictly online get kicked out or suspended at NYU for attending a party, it's like, but wait, he doesn't go on campus. Why would you suspend somebody? So there's a whole new category of ridiculous sort of COVID restriction stuff with like I said, with trying to be very understanding. I do think there's one other effect that I think that was one of the reasons why we saw such a massive explosion of case submissions over the summer. When people are their Twitter personality or their Facebook personality 100% of the time, when you're online strictly, a lot of the normal human interaction that makes us a little bit more cautious, a little less brazen, maybe a little bit more circumspect, that just goes out the window. And I think that some of the more troubling aspects of the last year that you've seen has been people that they're not just their avatar some of the time, they're their avatar 100% of the time.
Okay. Sam, was there anything else that you wanted to add on 2020? All right. So speaking of some of these things that people might do when they are in their avatar, any comments on cancel culture? I'm going to use now the words that people are using: cancel culture, misinformation, disinformation, microaggressions. Anything on that front that has changed or that you see as being moving in a good trend or in a bad trend?
Mm-hmm.
So separate from 2020, are those things moving in a certain way on campus?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. The cancel culture thing is really frustrating for me because this was a phenomenon I was talking about and researching back in 2013 and 2014. And I'm in this ongoing argument about whether or not it's like the right term to use. And I'm like, but it's a phenomenon I was talking about before it was politicized the way it currently is. And what does frustrate me, and I have a long debate in Reason Magazine with Ken White about this, because he hates the term because he thinks it's too associated with Trump. And I get that, but Obama also makes this argument. Like a lot of Democrats make this argument. A lot of 150 overwhelmingly left-leaning people, signed the Harper's letter, agree with this. And I'm like, I'm not going to apologize because too many people agree with me. But people don't love that term. And I get it, but at the same time, it's like it's a real thing. Employers come to me all the time, both me and Haidt, and they say, you can't say what company this is, but right now everything's turned into an internal debate about the internal functioning of this organization in a way that's actually preventing us, for some real examples, providing direct services to the homeless, for example, which is just, it's really a shame. Disinformation. Some of you might have read the Emily Bazelon piece in the New York Times Magazine. I do actually think that is a very serious threat, and not just the actual factual disinformation, but the process by which you just make people cynical and skeptical of all things is a tough issue. I don't think it requires limiting the First Amendment or free speech. I think there are more speech ways to deal with it. There are ways, probably the one way that I think would actually deal with it that does have some First Amendment issues is lack of anonymity. That essentially, if people were connected to their Facebook accounts, if there was equivalent of Twitter where it was just really clear this is a real person, we know who this is, I think some of this stuff could be stopped to a degree. But the intentional intervention of other countries trying to mess with our heads, that's a tough thing that I didn't see coming 10 years ago. So I do take that issue very seriously.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you could have a whole other discussion, I think, about the way in which the internet, which is a set of commercially provisioned platforms, yet now serves as a primary public forum, is both a vexed space normatively, like what really ought to be the rules if the First Amendment doesn't quite apply. But then I think to Greg's point, I think really important, and we're getting an increasingly awareness that, one, not all kinds of information are the same. Accurate health information isn't the same thing as political speech, even though they can be conflated on the internet. And also that the foreign interference is a no-brainer from a normative perspective, even though it's computationally very difficult, in a way that someone sort of a resident of this country who thinks they're expressing themselves politically is a more complicated kind of question. And then again, I think we're still grappling with is that does speech become something qualitatively different when it's magnified times 100,000 versus a person? I mean, I would say I tend to be in the camp that has a little bit more trouble with cancel culture, partly because I think the term has become so underdetermined at this point. So not necessarily to rebuke all of the arguments. I'd say one of, I think, the tricky things that I think is important to take, a couple tricky things I think are important to take seriously. One is not all forms of disqualification are the same. And everyone on the internet saying, I'm not going to listen to you anymore is not the same as you've lost your tenure track job or your tenured faculty position. So one thing we've got to start to figure out is what are the forms of disqualification that we actually think are really problematic, period. And then what are the processes for different forms of disqualification? There's no process on the internet. If you're going to deprive someone of their job, there's a very different process. And what triggers that process legitimately? What does that process need to contain? And to the foregoing discussion, when is that process itself like the problem around and taking us away from what we should be focusing on is the second thing I'd say. I think a third thing I'd say, though, to be more positive, sort of on the solution side, is I think one of the important things we'll look back on this summer as a society, if we become a better society over time, is that what it meant to call racism a systemic problem became more concrete for a lot more people and in their own lives. And if you are someone who believes that implicit bias can be a problem, if you are someone who believes that the implicit constraints on a conversation can be just as depriving of someone's ability to speak as disqualification, then one of the positive things we can do is like invest a hell of a lot of energy in figuring out what are the things we need to do to make sure that everyone's a part of the conversation, to make sure that everyone feels they have the opportunity to make their voice heard, to make sure that we're actually committing to listening to those things. I don't think that'll solve the whole problem. This is not a kumbaya solution, but I just think like it's just as I think it's facile to say, because you said X, therefore you're disqualified. It's also facile to say, yeah, implicit bias is a problem, but I'm not really going to focus on that tactically in the conversations that I have the power to convene. So I think that's a proactive thing we can do that will drain. Greg said a really good word in this conversation, heat. Like, what are the settings that we can drain heat out of in our society? And we have to all commit ourselves to trying to do that. I think if we believe in the spirit of free expression, in addition to the codified value, codified legal values.
I mean, maybe we can now talk about it. We can maybe talk about some of the things that we weren't willing to talk about before. I've been using the DEF CON system, and it turns out DEF CON 1 is the worst, right? And we're at that level of heat, at DEF CON 1 or 2, and we want to bring that DEF CON down. So I agree with both of you on that front. So I want to end with this question, because part of the reason we did this is we had the two of you together at our annual meeting in, I think, 2017 in Charleston. And it was a very popular session, and things have changed since 2017. Things have changed since 2017. We've all learned a lot since 2017. And I wanted to end with just, now that you reflect back to where you were at that time and where you are today, what has surprised you the most in terms of what's changed when it comes to speech? Have your own views evolved in certain ways? I mean, what's changed since 2017 now that we have the two of you here together again? And we can start with whoever wants to go. Greg?
I mean, I've had so much personal stuff happen since then. I had my second kid. I had a tumor, like there was deaths in the family. It was just a very intense period, and it got me really And 2017 was when I was in the most intense part of getting ready for coddling the American mind. And the thing that I always try to bring people back to, because of course everybody knows me for my free speech work, but I'm always trying to bring people back to the mental health aspect of this too. Like that essentially, and that's one of the things that just terrified us. Like we wrote, this little article in 2015, saying that actually we think we're teaching a generation the habits of anxious and depressed people, so we should expect to see a little bit of a spike. And it was horrifyingly bad. And I think that I'm working on a documentary with Ted Balaker to actually really hit the mental health aspect of it. And so many people are suffering right now. I know so many people personally, who this was like, this month was just it. Like this was the most they could take. And just, to completely jump over, the cancel culture thing presents some very interesting issues. At the one hand, calling for someone to be fired is absolutely free speech. But when you've kind of taken several steps away, when organizations fire people, specifically for allegations that they might have an opinion, you're like, that's not necessarily very healthy for the state of a pluralistic democracy. The one simple solution, that can only promise to help, is slow it down. If more organizations in the middle of the summer said, listen, these are serious allegations you're making against this person, we're going to take 2 weeks to look into it. That heat, that I was mentioning from Twitter is hot, but it doesn't last all that long. And so I'm actually working on something with Camille Foster, talking about things businesses can do to sort of like handle, and I always try to be very clear. We're not saying anything as silly or stupid as you can't fire people for embarrassing the organization. What we're saying is be more circumspect about it. Value the fact that you have people who disagree, all of this kind of stuff. So the challenges of cancel culture was something that we kind of saw coming, but everything was just so much faster and so much more intense. That was the real shock of the last 3 years.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah. And Sam, how about you?
Yeah, I think some of the things that have changed since that conversation are obviously we've gotten, for the set of issues we cabined off, I think we've become much more sophisticated about the reasonable concerns we should have about the role of the internet in our democracy. Whatever its net benefits are, I think we're at a very low moment for the proposition that it's net beneficial for the democracy. And that's important, by the way, for this conversation, because the argument for its net benefit to democracy is democratization of speech and expression. And it's done many of those things. It's the argument that many of the CEOs still tend to hold up as the justification for taking a lot of friction out of the system, talk about slowing things down. They take a lot of friction out on that basis. So I think we've gotten smarter. I think we don't know the way forward. Knight invests in a lot of research to better understand how these phenomena work. I think we've got more anxiety than we have knowledge, for example, about what the effects of some of these systems are. So that's obviously been a big change. I do think, unfortunately, the kind of populist revanchism that dominates politics on the right and the left is not helpful on this issue, and that is only intensified. Again, look, I think one of the worst things that could have happened around the campus free speech issue is state legislators existing. I mean, the trying to make a campus a political crucible does not drain heat out of a situation, and making this a performative issue as opposed to a substantive issue about knowledge in our democracy, that hasn't helped any issue, right? We're testing that on COVID. It's not working either. And so I think that's been a change for the worse. I think actually one of the changes for the better is that I think a lot of the debates about race and free speech, it was very hard to disentangle an idea about racial justice and how totalizing that was. And now actually, after George Floyd, a lot more of those conversations have become about mental health and well-being. So they've become about what the experience of different people in an organization is when these moments happen, the kind of what's called the invisible work that certain members of an organization have to bear in those moments. I think actually that'll be good because it'll disentangle the how I feel about a conversation from what are the legitimate conversations to be had. And I think that if we can harness that, that'll be to the good. And I think to Greg's point, like at the end of the day, this comes part of democratic actualization is this process of democracy working, and part of it is about us flourishing as individuals inside that process. And I don't think you achieve that by turning away. Like I think you achieve that by looking into what the real experience of people is. So I'm hopeful that that'll actually be a good thing. It could be used as a cudgel to shut down conversations, but I'm hopeful that we won't get to that point, in part because I think to Greg's point, like everyone's going to leave 2020 exhausted. And the question is, what do you do with that? What do you do with that feeling moving forward?
Wow. Well, thank you both. I think this was a great time to have this conversation. Clearly, a lot has happened. Clearly a lot has happened, and clearly also a lot still needs to be done. And I really appreciated the fact that you were both very thoughtful and analytical in how you're thinking about campus and all the nuances and complexities of it, but also the go forward and how speech is just one issue that's connected to many other issues. Greg, very happy that you are healthy and here to have these conversations. And Sam, completely share your optimism about the fact that we are now more willing and able to be talking about certain issues that were harder to talk about before. I hope that takes us in a good new direction. And thank you both for being here to help with that process.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Debbie. It was really fun.
It was.
And I'm happy to answer further questions.